My card was declined, and just like that, they rolled my gurney right out into the cold hallway. Ethan swore he was going to find the money. He ran out those emergency doors and just vanished. The hospital system doesn't wait for anyone, and clearly neither did my husband, laying there shivering. I realized something truly terrifying. The worst part wasn't the agonizing pain tearing through my body. It was knowing I was about to die, and absolutely no one cared enough to keep me alive. Then, a shadow fell over my face. Let's rewind to just a few minutes before those emergency doors swung shut, before Ethan vanished into the cold night. I was lying there, fighting for every single breath. The fluorescent lights overhead were blinding, burning into my retinas. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor felt like a countdown, in ticking away the last moments of my life. And Ethan was sitting right beside my gurney. You know what is truly strange? When you are on the very edge of dying, your brain hyper-focuses on the tiniest, most insignificant details. I looked at my husband. I really looked at him. He was supposed to be a man terrified of losing his wife, a man whose entire world was crashing down around him. But there was no sweat on his forehead, no dark circles under his eyes, no trembling in his hands. His expensive charcoal wool coat was perfectly lint-free, buttoned up strictly against the winter chill. His hair, it was styled meticulously, not a single strand out of place. He smelled of rich cedar cologne, not the stale coffee and frantic panic you expect to find in an emergency room. "Elena, just hold on. I'm going to figure this out," he said. His voice was smooth, incredibly smooth, too smooth. It sounded exactly like a man who had practiced his lines in the rearview mirror before walking inside. He reached out and gently stroked my cold hand, but his thumb was tapping a restless, impatient rhythm against my knuckles, and his eyes never quite met mine. They kept darting over my shoulder, towards the exit signs, towards the large, sterile clock on the white wall. He was counting the minutes. Then, his phone buzzed in his coat pocket, a short, sharp vibration against the silence between us. He pulled it out just an inch, just enough to glance down at the glowing screen. I saw his jaw clench, and instantly, he shoved the device deep back into his pocket, his hand clamped firmly over the fabric, hiding it like a dark secret. "Who is it?" I tried to whisper, but the dry air scratched my throat. "Work." "It is just work, Elena," he answered quickly, brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead. I wanted to believe him. God, I really did. Because when you feel the absolute bone-deep chill of death creeping up your legs, you will cling to whatever is familiar. You desperately want to believe that the man holding your hand is your anchor, that he is your protector against the darkness. I closed my eyes, trying to draw some warmth from his touch, but his hand was already pulling away. "I need to make a call." "To the bank," he said, standing up abruptly. "I will be right back. I promise." He didn't wait for my response. He didn't wait to see if I was still breathing. He just turned his back and walked away. His footsteps echoed down the linoleum hallway, even, measured, unhurried footsteps. He wasn't running to save my life. He was just leaving. And as the sharp click of his leather shoes faded into the chaotic background noise of the hospital, a new, terrifying dread settled deep in my stomach. It was colder than the IV fluids dripping into my veins. The truth hit me with a sickening clarity. The most dangerous betrayers don't scream at you. They don't threaten you with a weapon. They speak to you softly, they tuck you in, and they are perfectly, appropriately gentle, right up until the moment they lock the door to your cage. He wasn't calm because he had a plan to save me. He was calm because he already knew exactly how this was going to end. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. The rhythmic, agonizingly slow beeping of the heart monitor was the only proof I was still alive. Ethan had signed a temporary payment commitment form at the front desk right before he walked out. That single piece of paper was supposed to be my lifeline, but laying there in the sterile chill, I realized it was a trap. It bought him the perfect, loving excuse to leave the building, and it locked me in a terrifying legal gray area. The hospital administration was forced to wait for that temporary deadline to expire. They were watching the clock, and the second the minute hand struck the hour, the atmosphere in the room turned to ice. The same administrative clerk marched back in. She wasn't just impatient anymore. She was ruthless. She held a thick red folder, tapping her pen against the hard plastic. The temporary grace period has officially expired," she announced, her voice entirely flat. "We have tried his cell phone 3 times. It goes straight to voicemail, and the backup credit card is completely frozen. We are initiating the immediate transfer protocol. Wait, you cannot move her." A young resident doctor stepped in front of my bed, blocking the clerk. I recognized his tired eyes. He had been the one gently adjusting my IV just an hour ago. Her vitals are plummeting. Her system is completely failing. Moving her to the county overflow ward in the basement right now will trigger a fatal cardiac event. He was pleading for my life. My chest tightened, grasping at that tiny, fragile spark of hope. Someone was fighting for me, but the clerk didn't even blink. She just flipped a page on her clipboard and looked the young doctor dead in the eye. "Doctor, this patient is uninsured. The guarantor has fled the premises, and she is currently occupying a Tier 1 trauma bed. If she codes in this specific room without financial clearance, the hospital assumes full, unmitigated legal and financial liability. Are you prepared to personally sign off on that risk? Are you taking her debt onto your own medical license?" The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the harsh rattling in my lungs. The young doctor froze, his shoulders slowly slumping. He looked down at me. I saw the helpless, quiet apology in his eyes. He slowly lowered his hands and stepped aside. Just like that, I was condemned. His medical oath was absolutely powerless against the crushing weight of the financial system. That was the exact moment the brutal truth hit me. Hospitals do not just demand money. They wait for an excuse. They need a procedural reason to look away. And Ethan had handed them the perfect, legally binding excuse on a silver platter. "Unlock the wheels," the clerk ordered. 2 orderlies grabbed the cold metal rails of my gurney. The harsh, sudden jolt sent a blinding wave of agony straight up my spine. "Please, no." I tried to beg, but the plastic oxygen mask muffled my pathetic voice. They didn't look at my face. They didn't see a terrified woman bleeding out from the inside. To them, I was just a backlogged file, an administrative error that needed to be erased. The loud squeak of the rubber wheels against the linoleum sounded like a judge slamming a gavel. They pushed me out of the bright, heavily monitored emergency room. The heavy double doors swung shut behind me with a sickening thud. I was rolled down a long, dim corridor and left parked against a peeling yellow wall in the drafty transfer wing. The heavy, bone-deep chill coming from the ambulance bay hit my bare skin. It was freezing. I lay there shivering violently, staring up at a single flickering fluorescent tube. The monitor was gone. The doctors were gone. I was entirely alone. And in that freezing, miserable silence, I finally understood my husband's brilliant, evil design. Ethan didn't run away in a panic. He knew exactly how the hospital protocols worked. He knew that in a massive, heartless system, a murderer doesn't need to get his hands dirty. He doesn't have to poison you or push you down the stairs. He just has to step back, act like a desperate, loving husband. Orion let the system's paperwork quietly suffocate you to death. The flickering fluorescent light above me finally buzzed and died. The hallway plunged into semi-darkness. I closed my eyes, letting the icy air numb my freezing skin. The pain was fading into a strange, heavy numbness. I was ready to let go. I really was. But then, the heavy double doors of the transfer wing violently swung open. It wasn't the slow, annoying squeak of an orderly's cart. It was the sharp, commanding crack of expensive leather shoes against the cheap linoleum. A lot of them. Moving fast. I forced my heavy eyelids open. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal pinstripe suit was standing directly over my rusted gurney. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't have a stethoscope. He radiated an absolute, terrifying kind of authority. And behind him stood two younger men carrying thick leather briefcases. And the hospital's chief administrator, a man I had never seen, who was currently sweating profusely and looking completely panicked. "Mr. Shaw, I assure you, this is just a standard administrative protocol." The chief administrator stammered, wringing his hands. The man, Mr. Shaw, didn't even look at him. He kept his piercing gray eyes locked entirely on my face. "If her heart stops beating in this filthy hallway, I will personally ensure this hospital is dismantled brick by brick," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It was deadly quiet, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "Bring your lead trauma team, now." Suddenly, the entire world exploded into frantic motion. So the exact same administrative clerk who had just kicked me out like a piece of garbage was now sprinting alongside my gurney. Her face was pale with absolute terror as she barked orders into a radio. The cold, drafty corridor blurred into a rush of warm lights, frantic apologies, and the squeak of brand new wheels. They weren't taking me to the basement overflow ward anymore. The private elevator chimed, opening to the top floor. The founder's wing. Thick carpet swallowed the sound of footsteps. Silk curtains blocked out the harsh city lights. The subtle scent of fresh lavender replaced the sharp burn of bleach. They carefully lifted me onto a bed that felt like a cloud. The monitors here didn't beep like a death countdown. They hummed softly. The contrast was dizzying. I had gone from an unpaid burden to the most important person in the building in less than 5 minutes. Once the doctors stabilized my IVs and left the room, Mr. Shaw pulled a velvet chair to my bedside. "I am Gideon Shaw," he said gently, looking at me with a strange, deep respect. "And you have been kept in the dark for far too long." I looked at him, my mind spinning, my throat still burning from the oxygen tube. Why are you doing this?" I managed to whisper. "Who am I to you?" He leaned in slightly. Sometimes true salvation isn't just someone pulling you back from the edge of death. It is someone recognizing your absolute, undeniable worth, long before you even remember it yourself. He opened a black leather folder on his lap. He reached inside and placed a single crisp photograph on my blanket. It was a picture of my husband. Ethan was getting into a sleek black sedan, holding a very specific sealed document envelope that belonged in my nightstand. "Your husband didn't just abandon you because he was scared of some hospital bills, Elena," Gideon said, his tone turning to absolute ice. "He walked away tonight because he finally secured the one thing he has been waiting 3 agonizing years to steal from you. And if he thinks you are going to just die quietly in that hallway, he is making a fatal miscalculation." The founder's recovery suite was terrifyingly quiet. The only sound was the soft, deliberate rustle of thick paper. Gideon sat in the velvet chair next to my bed, his face completely unreadable. He slowly opened that heavy black leather folder and placed a stack of documents right on my lap. "Look at them, Elena," he said quietly. My hands were still trembling from the IV drip as I picked up the first page. It was an old yellowed birth certificate. The ink was faded, but the embossed seal at the bottom was thick and golden. The name printed at the top wasn't Elena. It was Vivian Vale, the Vale family. They practically built this entire city. They owned the very hospital I was currently lying in. I stared at the name, my brain completely refusing to process it. For 28 years. I believed I was just an unwanted orphan, a girl with no roots, no family, and absolutely no future. I had spent my entire life apologizing just for taking up space. "You are the missing granddaughter of the Vale estate," Gideon said, his voice pulling me back to reality. "You were lost during the chaotic estate transition over 2 decades ago, and we have been searching for you ever since." I couldn't breathe. A massive, dizzying weight pressed down on my chest. I wasn't a nobody. I belonged somewhere. I had a real name. I had a family. But Gideon wasn't finished. His eyes darkened as he pulled out a second piece of paper. This one wasn't old. It was a crisp, newly printed email. He laid it deliberately over the birth certificate. "Finding out who you are is only the first truth," Gideon said, leaning closer. "The second truth is understanding why you have been kept in the dark. Read the date." I forced my blurry eyes to focus on the black text. It was an email from Ethan's private account, sent to an offshore private investigator. The date was exactly 3 years ago. 3 years. Long before I ever got sick. Long before we were supposedly struggling to pay the rent. I read the subject line out loud, my voice shaking. Vale Estate. Spousal inheritance and asset transfer. Suddenly, the room started spinning. The sterile air felt suffocating. Ethan knew. My sweet, supposedly stressed, hard-working husband knew exactly who I was. For 3 entire years. "He found your bloodline records," Gideon explained coldly. "But instead of telling you, he buried them. Because a missing heiress is worth millions. But a dead heiress with a legally bound widower is worth billions. Every single memory I had of my marriage suddenly twisted into something hideous and deformed. The times he sighed heavily when I asked for $20 for groceries. The way he made me feel so incredibly guilty for my medical bills. He kept me poor. He kept me completely isolated in that tiny, miserable basement apartment. Or he deliberately kept me trapped in a life that didn't even belong to me. He didn't walk away tonight because he was scared of the hospital fees. He walked away because the waiting game was finally over. He was just waiting for my heart to stop so he could step over my body and cash out the life insurance, the survivor benefits, and the Vale Trust Fund. The deepest, most evil kind of manipulation isn't just someone lying to you. It is someone forcing you to live in a pathetic, low version of yourself, training you to believe you are absolutely worthless, so you never even dare to question your own reality. Hot, stinging tears hit my cheeks, but this time, it wasn't sadness. It was pure, burning rage. Ethan didn't just leave his wife to die. He carefully built my coffin, locked me inside, and spent 3 years watching me run out of air. I sat up in the wide, comfortable hospital bed. A sleek silver tablet rested on my lap. Gideon had given me full access to the private investigator's secure server. I stared at the glowing screen. My hands gripped the cold metal edges so hard my knuckles turned entirely white. Every single file I opened was another nail in the coffin of my marriage. For 3 entire years, Ethan made me feel incredibly guilty for buying cheap, generic medicine. "We are on a tight budget, Elena," he would say, sighing that heavy, exhausting sigh as he looked at our bills. But right here on the screen, the truth was staring back at me in cold, hard numbers, hidden offshore bank statements, a signed lease for a luxury high-rise apartment downtown, receipts for diamond earrings, silk dresses, and designer bags, and the ride-share history, pinpointing exactly where he went the nights he claimed he was working late to pay for my medical treatments. He was with her, a woman named Vanessa. He bought her a $5,000 tennis bracelet on the exact same day I was begging a triage nurse for extra painkillers. I didn't even feel sad. I just felt numb. When a person is carefully taught to believe they deserve to be treated terribly, when they are trained to see themselves as a massive burden, they stop looking for the truth. They just accept the miserable crumbs they are given. I was so busy apologizing for taking up space. I never once realized I was actually the bank funding his entire secret life. But the betrayal didn't stop at stolen money and another woman's expensive perfume. No. Ethan was far more calculating than that. The heavy wooden door to my suite suddenly clicked open. A tall man in a crisp black suit and a white coat walked in. He wasn't one of the regular floor nurses. He held a thick, sealed medical file. "Miss Vale, I am Dr. Malcolm Reed, the chief toxicologist," he said, pulling up a velvet chair. His voice was grim, carefully measured. "We rushed a comprehensive toxicology panel on your blood work yesterday." I looked at him, my stomach twisting into a cold knot. "It is just a severe autoimmune failure, isn't it?" Dr. Reed slowly shook his head. "No, your organs are not failing naturally. We found lethal concentrated levels of heavy metals in your system, thallium and arsenic." The room went completely silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning. What does that mean?" I whispered, the air catching in my throat. "It means you are not sick. You are being poisoned," he replied flatly. "And based on the tissue accumulation in your blood, this wasn't a single massive dose. Someone has been administering this poison to you slowly, systematically, for at least 8 months. 8 months. My mind raced backward, the sudden onset of my mysterious symptoms, the extreme paralyzing fatigue, the way my hair started falling out in clumps on my pillow, and Ethan, sweet, caring, devoted Ethan. Every single night before bed, he would boil water in our cramped, moldy kitchen. He would bring me a steaming ceramic canister of herbal tonic. "You need to build your strength, Elena," he would say, watching me closely to make sure I drank every last drop. He never let me skip a single night, and he stood right there in the dim kitchen light, smiling warmly, while I swallowed the very thing that was systematically destroying my organs. A terrifying, freezing clarity washed over my entire body. The chill ate straight through my bones. Some people do not poison you because they hate you in a passionate, fiery rage. They don't want to watch you suffer out of malice. They just do the math. Ethan looked at me and saw a walking expiration date. He saw a massive inheritance check waiting at the finish line. He didn't just want me gone. He wanted me to die slowly enough so it looked like a tragic, completely natural illness. He was a cold, calculated predator, and I had been thanking him for his kindness, drinking his poison every single night, and apologizing for the absolute inconvenience of my own murder. And I did not wake up the next morning as a miraculous, powerful heiress. There was no magic wand. There was no sudden, glorious cinematic montage where I stepped out of bed and was instantly healed. The reality of surviving severe heavy metal poisoning is ugly, and it is excruciatingly slow. For the first 2 weeks, my body was an active war zone. My skin was practically translucent. I sat in a massive velvet chair by the window for 6 hours a day, watching thick, dark antidotes and high-dose vitamins drip from IV bags into my bruised, collapsed veins. Every single muscle in my body violently cramped. My hands shook so uncontrollably that I couldn't even lift a simple glass of water to my own lips. The bitter, metallic taste of arsenic lingered deep in the back of my throat, a constant, sickening reminder of my husband's nightly cup of tea. The nights were the absolute worst. I couldn't sleep. I would lay in that massive, luxurious bed, staring up at the silk canopy, sweating through the expensive sheets. The dizziness was so intense I felt like the room was constantly spinning. I had terrifying panic attacks where I would wake up gasping for air, my hands frantically gripping the mattress, expecting to feel the cheap, worn-out sheets of our damp basement apartment, expecting to see Ethan standing in the doorway, checking his watch to see if I was dead yet. But Gideon Shaw didn't just hire the best toxicologists in the country to flush the poison out of my liver. He knew that fixing my organs was only 10% of the battle. The real poison, the absolute worst damage Ethan had done to me, was in my mind. Once the violent tremors finally started to subside, the true rehabilitation began. It wasn't physical therapy. It was identity reconstruction. Gideon brought in coaches. Every afternoon we worked in the grand library of the suite. I had to relearn the most basic human functions. I had to learn how to walk, not just putting one foot in front of the other, but walking like a woman who absolutely owns the floor she is stepping on. "Keep your chin perfectly parallel to the ground," Gideon would say, his voice echoing in the large room. "Stop dropping your shoulders. Stop trying to fold yourself in half to make other people comfortable. You are a veil. You do not shrink for anyone." Then, we worked on my voice. For 3 years, I had spoken in a soft, breathy, apologetic whisper, in the pathetic voice of a woman who was constantly terrified of being too expensive, too needy, too annoying. Gideon refused to answer me if I spoke in that pitch. "Speak from your chest," he commanded, sliding a heavy leather folder across the mahogany table. "Lower your pitch. Stop ending your sentences like a question. You are giving a directive, not asking for permission." He forced me to practice eye contact. He would stand just inches away and stare me down. Whenever I nervously looked at the floor, we started over. He taught me the crushing, terrifying weight of boardroom etiquette. He taught me how to use stillness as a weapon. When a man expects you to answer him immediately, "You let him wait," Gideon instructed, pouring himself a glass of water. "Most people are terrified of silence, and they will nervously babble just to fill the quiet, and they will accidentally hand you all their secrets. The first person to break the silence in a negotiation is always the one who loses. Let them drown in it." It took exactly 8 weeks, 56 agonizing days of physical therapy, blood draws, and standing in front of a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror until I stopped recognizing the terrified, fragile girl staring back at me. Gideon didn't magically create a brand new person out of thin air. He just violently peeled back the heavy, suffocating layers of guilt, the deep trauma, the endless, pathetic apologies that Ethan had relentlessly hammered into my brain. He chiseled away the dying shell of Elena, so the real Vivian Vale could finally breathe. On the last day of the 8th week, I stood in front of that mirror. And I was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored black suit. My spine was perfectly straight. My gaze was cold and heavy. I didn't just look rich, I looked incredibly dangerous. And in that quiet moment, I realized a profound truth. True recovery has absolutely nothing to do with getting a makeover or looking beautiful. True recovery, the only kind that actually matters, is the exact moment you stop apologizing for your own existence. I didn't hire a private investigator to hunt Ethan down. I didn't scream at him over the phone or confront him in the lobby of his cheap apartment building. If you want to catch a calculated, starving predator, you don't chase them into the dark woods. You just put a massive, irresistible piece of bait right in the middle of a shiny steel cage and leave the door wide open. Through Gideon's financial network, I silently bought up the majority debt of Ethan's struggling, desperate development project. Once I owned his lifelines, I had my assistant send him a very formal, very exclusive invitation, a private, closed-door meeting with his new primary investor, the elusive Vivian Vale. He arrived at the downtown high-rise exactly 15 minutes early. I sat in the darkened security room, watching him on the monitors. He stepped out of the elevator, aggressively smoothing his expensive silk tie. He checked his reflection in the tinted glass walls, practicing his charming, fake, perfectly white smile. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He was a man who thought he was finally about to step into the wealthy life he believed he deserved. He could literally smell the money. The heavy, defrosted glass doors of the boardroom finally slid open. I sat dead center at the head of a massive, cold obsidian table. I was wearing a sharply tailored, bone-white suit. My hair was pulled back tightly, my posture rigid and flawless. I didn't look down at my hands. I didn't shrink into the leather chair. I just sat in absolute, suffocating silence. and watched my husband walk toward me. He stopped at the edge of the table. He looked me directly in the eyes, and he smiled. A polite, eager, painfully respectful smile. He didn't recognize me. Not even a single tiny flash of hesitation crossed his face. It wasn't some miraculous disguise, and it wasn't plastic surgery. It was just the ugly, arrogant truth. For 3 entire years, Ethan never actually looked at his wife. He only ever saw a sick, pathetic, expensive burden taking up space in his basement. His brain simply could not process that a powerful woman holding a $50 million portfolio could possibly be the same frail girl he left to die in a drafty hospital hallway. "Please take a seat, Ethan," I said. My voice was low, completely steady, devoid of any warmth. "Thank you for this incredible opportunity, Miss Vale," he replied smoothly, confidently unbuttoning his jacket as he sat down. "I assure you, my project is on the verge of a massive breakthrough." I didn't blink. I didn't offer him a glass of water. I just slid a thick, black, leather-bound folder across the polished glass table. "Let us skip the desperate sales pitch, Ethan," I interrupted coldly. "I know exactly what you are worth. This is a convertible debt agreement. It covers your entire operational deficit immediately. But my collateral requirements are absolute." He picked up the heavy gold pen resting next to the folder. He was so blinded by the zeros on the first page, he didn't even bother to flip to the fine print. He didn't read Clause 7. He didn't realize that he was legally locking up all of his current and future assets, including any anticipated survivor benefits, life insurance payouts, or newly inherited spousal trust funds. If he defaulted on this project, I owned everything he had, and more importantly, I legally owned every single penny he was planning to steal from my corpse. "Is there a problem with the terms?" I asked softly, watching his hand hover over the dotted line. "No problem at all, Miss Vale," he practically purred, pressing the gold tip to the paper. The sharp, aggressive scratch of his ink felt louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. He signed his name with a confident flourish, handing the folder back to me like he had just won the lottery. I looked down at his messy signature, and a slow, terrifying chill settled deep in my chest. Truly evil men rarely lose because their victims suddenly grow stronger than them. They lose because they are so blindly, desperately arrogant. They trust their own bottomless greed far more than they trust the truth. "Welcome to the portfolio, Ethan," I whispered. The black sedan idled quietly at the end of the narrow alley. I stepped out into the freezing rain, pulling the dark collar of my coat tight against my neck to block the chill. We were back, and the rusty iron gate of my old basement apartment building groaned heavily as Gideon pushed it open. The air down here was exactly how I remembered it. Heavy, damp, thick with the miserable smell of cheap bleach and rotting wood. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the walls closing in on me. For 3 agonizing years, this pathetic, suffocating little box was my entire world. It was the place where I learned to shrink myself, where I learned to speak in whispers, where I learned to apologize just for breathing the air. Gideon stood silently by the broken door frame, watching me closely as I walked into the cramped kitchen. The cheap laminate countertops were covered in dust and scattered unopened mail. The drawers were pulled out. Ethan had clearly been tearing the place apart looking for something. Trying to cover his tracks before the police could ever get involved. But I knew exactly what I was here for. I knelt down slowly on the cracked linoleum floor, right next to the overflowing plastic trash can. Hidden under a pile of discarded food wrappers lay the shattered pieces of a familiar ceramic canister, my nightly herbal tonic. The same cup he handed me with a warm smile every single night. He had smashed it against the wall, trying to completely destroy the evidence of his crime. But in his frantic panic, he was sloppy. He was careless. I carefully picked up the largest, most jagged piece of ceramic. A thick, chalky white, powdery residue was still caked deeply inside the bottom edge. The heavy metals, the poison, the physical, undeniable proof of my slow, agonizing murder. I held the sharp shard tightly in my palm, and squeezing it until the edges almost cut into my skin, I didn't cry. I just stared at it. There's a strange, incredibly powerful kind of magic in facing your own worst nightmares. The place that once made you feel the absolute lowest. The place that mercilessly stripped away every single ounce of your dignity. If you are just strong enough to walk back into it, it becomes the exact place where you finally reclaim your voice. I have it, I whispered to Gideon, carefully slipping the broken piece into a clear plastic evidence bag. But before I could even stand up, the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door violently clicked. Gideon and I completely froze. The loud, metallic sound of a key sliding into the lock echoed through the tiny, silent apartment. Someone was unlocking the door. Not just someone. I knew that. Heavy, impatient twist of the wrist, I knew that exact sound. It was Ethan. He was supposed to be all the way across town, trapped at a massive hours-long investor dinner I had personally funded just to keep him busy. "Get back," Gideon hissed urgently, grabbing my arm and forcefully pulling me into the narrow, pitch-black shadows of the hallway closet. The front door suddenly swung open. It hit the drywall with a loud, aggressive thud. Heavy leather shoes stepped onto the creaky hardwood floor. My heart pounded so violently against my ribs, I honestly thought it was going to break through my chest. I pressed my back hard against the cold, damp plaster, desperately covering my mouth with both hands to completely block out the sound of my own terrified breathing. Ethan walked straight into the dark kitchen. He was standing exactly where I had been kneeling just 10 seconds ago. The sharp, familiar scent of his expensive cedar cologne mixed with the rotting, moldy smell of the basement, making my stomach violently churn. He viciously kicked the trash can. He was cursing aggressively under his breath, destroying the kitchen all over again. I could clearly see the dark outline of his shoes through the tiny crack in the closet door. He was less than 3 feet away from me. If he turned the handle, if he opened this door. There was no legal team waiting outside. There was no secure boardroom to protect me. It was just me, trapped in the exact same dark, suffocating cage he had originally built for me then. His angry footsteps stopped right in front of the closet. I did not wait for him to realize his fatal mistake, and I triggered the trap the very next morning. Sitting in my quiet, sunlit penthouse office, I stared at the financial dashboard on my silver tablet. I gave my legal team a single, silent nod. Strike one. All funding for his massive downtown development was instantly, permanently frozen. Strike two. A heavy, formal default notice was hand-delivered directly to his desk. It demanded immediate repayment of the entire loan with crushing, impossible penalties. He was completely bankrupt before he even finished his morning coffee, but destroying his bank account was never the ultimate goal. I needed to destroy his mind. Strike three. I picked up an untraceable burner phone. I slowly typed a single, simple text message to his private number. "How did the herbal tonic taste last night, Ethan? I hope you managed to clean up the broken ceramic in the kitchen." I hit send. I watched the GPS tracker on his car light up almost immediately. He didn't call the bank. He didn't call his expensive corporate lawyers. He completely panicked, and he drove dangerously fast straight back to the hospital. I could see the security footage later. He practically ran into the administrative wing, pushing past sick patients in the hallway. His perfectly styled hair was a mess. His expensive silk tie was ripped open. He was sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights. He slammed his hands down on the front desk, aggressively demanding a copy of his deceased wife's death certificate. He needed to claim that life insurance money immediately to save his sinking company. but the administrative clerk just stared at him. Aura, completely confused. "I am so sorry, sir. We have absolutely no record of an Elena Vale passing away in our facility," the clerk said, checking her monitor again. "In fact, we have no record of her being transferred anywhere. She is just gone." The hospital cameras captured the exact moment his entire reality fractured. His face went completely pale. His hands started shaking uncontrollably against the counter. If there was no death certificate, where was the body? Where was the frail, pathetic wife he had spent 8 months systematically poisoning? And while Ethan was desperately searching the city for a ghost, his perfect loyal partner was already turning against him. Vanessa was greedy. But she was definitely not a fool when Ethan's corporate account suddenly locked down and his credit card started declining. And she didn't rush to his side to comfort him. She didn't offer to help him fight instead. She sat alone in the luxury apartment he bought her, and she opened her laptop. She quickly dug up the original 3-year-old email about my bloodline and the massive inheritance money. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of his premeditated crime. She carefully forwarded a copy of that email to a hidden encrypted server. She wasn't saving it to help him. She was keeping it as her own personal leverage. She was fully preparing to sell him out to the police the absolute second she needed to save herself. Ethan was now completely trapped in a suffocating nightmare of his own making. He was rapidly bleeding money. He was being hunted by an invisible enemy who knew his darkest secrets. And his own mistress was quietly sharpening a knife right behind his back. He had no idea who to be terrified of anymore. The law, his accomplices, or his own past coming back from the dead. Because a truly evil person does not actually fear justice. When the cold metal handcuffs finally click around their wrists, no. The real paralyzing terror begins in that quiet, suffocating moment, when they finally realize the truth has completely left their hands, and they are no longer the one writing the ending to the story. The annual Vale Acquisition Gala was held in the glass-walled Sky Ballroom on the 50th floor. The room was a blinding sea of crystal chandeliers, expensive champagne, and ruthless billionaires. And right in the middle of it all was Ethan. He slipped through the heavy mahogany doors, his hand buried deep in his tuxedo pocket. His eyes were frantic, darting across the room. He didn't come here to network. He came here cornered, desperate, and heavily armed. He was looking for the elusive Vivian Vale, planning to slide a sharp steel letter opener into my ribs, steal my secure hard drive, and vanish into the night. But you cannot ambush a woman who built the entire stage. I tapped a silver spoon against my crystal glass. The sharp, piercing ring instantly silenced the entire ballroom. Hundreds of powerful guests turned toward the main podium. I stepped into the bright, blinding spotlight, wearing a stunning, floor-length crimson silk gown. I looked down at the crowd, and I locked eyes directly with my husband. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing perfectly through the massive sound system. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating corporate acquisitions. We are celebrating a very specific, very ambitious kind of investment, the kind that requires absolute, ruthless dedication. I would like to invite our newest partner to the stage. Please welcome Ethan Vance." The crowd clapped politely. Ethan froze, his face drained of all color. He looked at me, truly looked at my face under the bright stage lights, and I saw the exact terrifying second his brain finally connected the dots. His breathing stopped. He stumbled forward, forced up the velvet stairs by the sheer pressure of 100 expectant eyes. He stood right next to me at the podium, trembling violently. "You have worked so incredibly hard for this exact moment, Ethan," I whispered, stepping back. "Let us show everyone your brilliant portfolio." And I pressed a single button on the podium console. The giant LED screens behind us didn't show a financial chart. They went pitch black, and a crisp, amplified audio recording filled the silent ballroom. "She doesn't have much time left. Just keep the hospital administration distracted until her heart gives out. The trust fund clears in 30 days. It was Ethan's voice. Cold, calculating, and absolutely clear. The crowd gasped. The polite applause completely vanished, replaced by a suffocating, icy tension. But I didn't stop. I pressed the button again. The screen flashed bright white, displaying his offshore bank statements right next to the time-stamped security footage from the hospital valet. "Look closely, gentlemen," I announced, projecting my voice over the stunned crowd. Notice the exquisite timing. And while his wife was actively dying on a rusted gurney in a drafty hallway, our brilliant investor here was busy purchasing a $5,000 diamond bracelet for his mistress. Ethan was hyperventilating. He took a step toward the edge of the stage, but Gideon and 4 massive security guards smoothly blocked the stairs. He was completely trapped. And for his final, masterful acquisition, I continued, my voice dropping to a deadly, unforgiving chill. I pressed the button one last time. A glowing, highly detailed medical toxicology report filled the massive screens. It highlighted the lethal concentrations of arsenic and thallium in bright red ink. He didn't just wait for his wife to die. He patiently, lovingly fed her heavy metals in her tea every single night for 8 months. The ballroom was dead silent, and it was no longer a high society gala. It had transformed into a brutal, silent execution. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the city were staring at him with absolute disgust. Men who humiliate you in the dark, men who make you feel tiny and worthless in the privacy of a locked house, are always terrified of the exact same thing. They are absolutely paralyzed by the moment you drag their filthy, pathetic reality out into the blinding light of a crowd. "Shut up!" Ethan suddenly screamed, his voice cracking with pure, animalistic panic. "Shut up!" He completely snapped. He pulled the long, sharp steel letter opener from his tuxedo jacket and lunged directly at my throat. The crowd screamed in absolute horror. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even take a single step back. Before the blade could even come close to my silk dress, Gideon's hand shot out. He grabbed Ethan's wrist and twisted it violently. The heavy steel blade clattered uselessly onto the polished wooden stage. Ethan hit the floor with a sickening thud, immediately pinned down by 3 security guards. I stood over him, looking down at his pathetic, trembling body as he gasped for air against the hard floorboards. "You brought a cheap knife to a corporate gala, Ethan," I whispered, crouching down so only he could hear me. "But I brought the entire life you tried to bury." He struggled violently against the heavy black boots of the security guards, his face pressed painfully hard against the polished floorboards. I knelt down slowly, letting the heavy red silk of my gown pool gracefully around my knees. I reached up with trembling fingers, playing the part of a terrified victim one last time, and I carefully unbuttoned the top of my collar. I pulled the expensive fabric back just an inch, exposing the small, dark, crescent-shaped birthmark resting right above my left collarbone. It was the exact same mark he used to trace with his thumb on Sunday mornings, long before he started hiding poison in my kitchen cupboards. I leaned in so close he could smell the faint scent of lavender on my skin. And then I completely dropped the cold, commanding pitch of Vivian Vale. "Ethan, honey, why are you looking at me like that?" I whispered. I let my voice crack. I made it soft, breathy, and pathetic, perfectly mimicking the dying girl he had left behind in that hospital corridor. His entire body went completely rigid. His eyes widened so far I thought they would burst from his skull. The absolute, paralyzing horror bleeding into his face was magnificent. He didn't just realize he was ruined, he realized he had been completely outsmarted by the woman he thought was too weak to survive. But the absolute worst kind of nightmare doesn't end with a single dramatic shock. I stood back up and smoothly adjusted my dress. "You thought you were so brilliant, Ethan," I said, my voice instantly turning back to solid, unforgiving ice. But a predator is only as safe as the desperate people he pays to keep his secrets. The heavy mahogany doors of the Sky Ballroom suddenly swung open again. 2 uniformed police detectives walked in, and right behind them was Vanessa. She wasn't wearing the $5,000 diamond tennis bracelet he had bought her. She looked exhausted, so clutching a thick brown manila folder directly against her chest like a shield. Ethan gasped. He desperately tried to lift his head off the floor. "Vanessa, tell them," he choked out, his voice cracking with animalistic desperation. "Tell them she is insane." But Vanessa didn't even look at his face. She walked straight past his pinned body, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and handed the folder directly to the lead detective. It contained everything. Every single encrypted email, the stolen bloodline records, the hidden offshore bank transfers, and the time-stamped receipts for the heavy metals. She didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. She traded his entire life to the authorities just to guarantee her own immunity. A truly wicked man can mentally prepare himself for public humiliation. He can even prepare to face the harsh judgment of the law. But he can never prepare for the exact moment his loyal partner looks him dead in the eye and casually sells his soul to save her own skin. The detective pulled a pair of heavy handcuffs from his belt. The sharp metallic click echoed across the silent ballroom as they locked tightly around Ethan's wrists. They yanked him roughly to his feet. He looked so incredibly small, so pathetically weak. But I knew the cold truth. Putting a monster in a police cruiser is only the beginning of his punishment. True justice does not come like a sudden lightning strike. It comes like a massive, slow, unstoppable grinding machine. And that machine had already started tearing his world apart. At that exact moment, across the city, federal agents were kicking down the glass doors of his corporate office. They were yanking the hard drives out of his servers, sealing his filing cabinets with red evidence tape. His bank accounts were instantly frozen. The life insurance payouts were permanently canceled. The hospital administration board was being dragged into emergency interrogation rooms. The corrupt brokers who helped him forge the paperwork were being pulled out of their beds in handcuffs. Every single person who looked the other way while I was dying was being relentlessly hunted down. Everything he had built on top of my pain was turning to dust in minutes. Take him out through the freight elevator. "I don't want his face ruining my reception," I ordered calmly. He started screaming. He was violently begging for mercy as they dragged him backward across the marble floor. But I didn't look back. I simply picked up my champagne, took a slow sip, and listened to the heavy doors slam shut on his entire existence. The Vale family estate was entirely silent. The massive, heavy oak doors were closed off to the outside world, and the only light came from the soft, warm glow of the lamps illuminating the grand memorial wall. I stood completely alone in the center of the vast marble room. My heels made absolutely no sound on the thick, imported rugs. I looked up at the gold letters engraved deep into the cold stone. Generations of my family, people who built empires. People who never once had to apologize for taking up space in the world, and right at the bottom, there was a blank. An empty space where my name was supposed to have been carved 28 years ago. I reached out and pressed my fingertips against the solid marble. It was so incredibly different from the rusted, shaking metal of the hospital gurney. I closed my eyes, letting the profound, absolute stillness of the room wash over my skin. Ethan was currently sitting in a freezing concrete holding cell. Stripped of his tailored suits, his stolen money, and his arrogant, perfectly practiced smile, he had lost absolutely everything. But as I stood there in the quiet, I realized something strange. I didn't hate him because we were poor. I didn't even hate him for sleeping with another woman in a luxury apartment. Those are just ordinary, pathetic betrayals. No, I hated him for what he systematically did to my human dignity. and I hated him for looking at a terrified, dying woman and successfully convincing her that her pain was a massive inconvenience. The memories flashed violently behind my eyelids, sharp and absolutely disgusting. I remembered desperately holding back my agonizing coughs in the middle of the night, biting my own lips so hard it bled. Just so I wouldn't wake him up, I remembered the heavy, crushing guilt I felt every single time I had to ask him to buy my cheap, generic painkillers. He carefully, methodically trained me to believe that my very existence was a debt I could never possibly repay. He made me feel like the absolute worst thing a human being could be. A burden. When you are abused like that for years, you don't just magically snap back to normal once the villain is locked away. You do not get your innocence back. And the frail, terrified girl named Elena, the one who blindly drank poison and whispered thank you. She actually did die in that drafty hospital hallway. She had to die. But the woman standing here tonight, Vivian Vale, she does not shrink. She does not ask for permission to breathe the air. People always think that justice is a dramatic, satisfying courtroom verdict. They think it is the loud slam of a judge's gavel or the sharp, heavy click of handcuffs around a wrist. But that is only legal justice. Legal justice is incredibly easy. True emotional justice is so much harder. Emotional justice is not just about putting a greedy monster inside a tiny prison cell. It is about completely, ruthlessly evicting their voice from your own head. It is about standing in front of a mirror and aggressively cutting off the absolute power they had over how you define yourself. Ethan desperately wanted me to die, believing I was worthless. But I am the one who gets to write the final sentence of this story. If you are listening to this right now, if you are sitting in the dark, feeling exhausted, feeling like your pain is just ruining the lives of the people around you, I need you to hear me. If anyone in your life has ever made you feel like you are too loud, too sick, too expensive, or too difficult to love, you need to understand exactly what they are doing. They are not telling you the brutal truth about who you are. They are lying to you, to keep you incredibly small. They want you to feel like a burden. Because a person who feels like a burden will never demand respect. They will never stand up and fight back. They will just quietly, gratefully accept whatever miserable scraps they are given. Do not let them write your story. Do not ever apologize for fighting for your own life. That definition of you, the label they forced onto your shoulders, it never belonged to them in the first place. I opened my eyes and looked at the blank space on the marble wall one last time. I didn't need to carve my name into the stone to know exactly who I was anymore. I turned my back on the memorial, and I walked out of the room, leaving the heavy doors wide open behind me.